It was late afternoon in early fall, the kind of day that carried just enough warmth to keep the wind from biting. Grant Park was nearly empty, save for the rustle of leaves underfoot and the occasional bark of a distant dog. The trees had begun their slow undressing. Scattered gold and rust-colored leaves lay across the cobbled walkways like quiet reminders of time passing. On a weathered bench beneath a sycamore tree, James Turner sat alone. He wore a simple gray coat, collar turned up, and a soft wool cap pulled low on his brow. His hands, knotted with time and memory, rested gently on a cane across his lap. He wasn't reading, wasn't scrolling a phone. He just sat, looking out at the pond, at the ducks gliding through still water, at nothing in particular. It was his favorite bench, the same one he came to every Tuesday after lunch. He liked the silence, or maybe he had simply grown used to it. A breeze stirred the branches above, and with it came a familiar ache in his leg, the same leg that carried a scar no one else ever saw. He winced slightly, shifted his weight, then exhaled long and low. He didn't notice her at first. She walked slowly, deliberately, holding a paperback novel to her chest, a scarf wrapped around her neck, the same deep burgundy as the one his mother used to wear in church. Her hair, silver white and soft, was swept neatly to one side. She paused by the bench, glanced around, then gently lowered herself onto the opposite end. Neither said a word. For a while they just shared the silence. James glanced sideways. Something in the curve of her posture, the way her hands folded in her lap. It stirred something familiar. He considered speaking, but didn't. The years had taught him that strangers didn't always want conversation. So he turned his gaze back to the pond. Then just as the wind shifted again, she laughed, softly, barely audible, but unmistakably real. And James froze. He didn't look at her right away. He waited, heart suddenly uncertain, thoughts rushing too quickly to catch. Finally he turned. She was already looking at him. Her eyes didn't widen. She didn't gasp. She just smiled slowly, the corners of her mouth trembling as though they too were remembering something they thought had been lost. And then she spoke. "I used to know someone who sat just like that," she said. "Back when we thought we had all the time in the world. It was the summer of 1969, and everything felt like it could last forever." James had just turned 20, tall and wiry with calloused hands from helping his father repair tractors out behind their old barn. Eleanor was 17, full of music and sunlight, always barefoot in the grass and always humming something old from the radio. She had a way of laughing without sound, like even joy was a secret. They met at a church social dance on a Friday night. James had only gone because his buddy dared him to. Eleanor was there with her older sister. He asked her to dance, nervously, stiffly, and she said yes before he could even finish the question. They stumbled through a slow song, both too aware of how close their hands were, how little they knew what they were doing. But when the music ended, neither of them let go. From that night on, they were inseparable. They'd meet at the diner after Eleanor's shifts at the library, walk along the riverbank, shoes in hand, talk about things they didn't really understand, cities they'd never seen, lives they thought they'd build, dreams too big for the little town that raised them. They talked like there was time. James always walked her home, always stopped at the porch, and every time, he waited for her to say goodnight first, because he knew if she didn't, he wouldn't be able to leave. Then came August. The letter arrived in a brown envelope with the Marine Corps seal stamped across the top. He didn't open it right away. He took it to her porch that night, holding it like something fragile, something burning. When she saw it, her voice caught in her throat. She asked if he was scared. He lied and said no. She said she'd write him every week. He promised he'd write back. They sat on the porch swing, barely talking, her head on his shoulder, the cicadas buzzing too loudly in the trees. The night before he left, they lay under the stars behind her house, staring up at a sky that suddenly felt too big. She wore his jacket, even though it was warm. He kissed her like he didn't want to stop. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, they stood at the old train station with peeling paint and a cracked platform. His duffel was heavy at his feet, boots polished, orders tucked in his coat. She wore a pale yellow dress and tried to smile. The train rumbled in the distance. When it arrived, steam hissed out like a sigh, and the conductor's voice was too cheerful for what it was calling. James hugged her tight, both arms around her waist like he could anchor himself to the earth with her heartbeat. She didn't cry, not until he stepped up into the car. And just before the door closed, he turned to look at her one last time. She wasn't waving. She was holding his dog tags in her hand, pressed tight to her chest. He never saw her again. Not after that day. Until now. The first few weeks overseas felt like a strange dream. Heat and mud, names and ranks, training drills that melted into exhaustion. James held on to Eleanor's memory like a thread tied around his heart. He carried a photo of her, creased from folding and unfolding, in the inner pocket of his uniform, right over his ribs. And true to her word, she wrote, "Every Friday, sometimes more." The first letter arrived 2 weeks after he deployed. Her handwriting danced across the page, steady and warm. She told him about the magnolia tree that had finally bloomed in her backyard, about a neighbor who'd gotten a new puppy, about a book she was reading that reminded her of him. But most of all, she told him how much she missed him and how she'd be counting the days until he came back. James wrote back every chance he got. His words were shorter, more clipped, part exhaustion, part military discipline. But his feelings burned through every sentence. He told her about the guys in his unit, about learning to sleep with one eye open, and how he could still hear the train whistle that took him away from her. But then, the letters started arriving slower. Some weeks nothing came at all. And then, after a firefight in Quang Tri, James was wounded. A grenade had landed just far enough to spare his life, but close enough to shred muscle and break bone in his leg. The pain was blinding. The air smelled like burnt sand and blood. He remembered yelling for a medic, then darkness. He spent weeks in a field hospital. No mail, no pens, no paper, just morphine and waiting. When he finally asked for his mailbag, the nurse looked at him with soft eyes and said, "Nothing yet, soldier. Maybe tomorrow." But tomorrow never came. What he didn't know was that Eleanor had never stopped writing. She sent letter after letter, pouring her days into ink, always ending with, "Come home soon." But somewhere between jungle posts and reassignments, the system lost track. Her letters piled up at bases he'd already left. And his, never written during recovery, left her waiting in silence. Months passed. The war dragged on, and so did the silence. Back in Charleston, Eleanor tried to stay strong. She waited. She prayed. But slowly, the world kept turning without her consent. People stopped asking about James. Neighbors stopped bringing up the war. And one day, she received a visit from her mother's friend at the post office. He said he hadn't seen a letter from James in a long time. He meant well. But the sentence struck like a hammer. She held on to hope for a while longer. But something inside her shifted. By the time she turned 22, she met a man named Thomas. He wasn't like James. He was safe, predictable, kind in a quiet, detached way. And when he asked her to marry him, she said yes. Not because she stopped loving James, but because she had no idea if he was still alive. Their wedding was small, her dress was simple, and her smile, though polite, never quite reached her eyes. She moved away after the wedding, started a new life in a new town, had a child, took on responsibilities that kept her busy enough to forget, but never completely. Meanwhile, James returned from the war with a limp, a bronze star he didn't ask for, and a hole in his chest he couldn't name. He went back to Charleston, found her house empty, her parents gone. The neighbor kid said something about a wedding last year. He didn't ask for details. He just walked home with the sun burning against his neck like a punishment. He never married. He worked construction, then carpentry, then retired early when the pain in his leg got too loud to ignore. Through all the years, through every town and job and hospital visit, he never let go of the photo she gave him. It stayed in his wallet, worn and faded, edges curling, like a memory trying not to disappear. They didn't see each other again. Not through letters, not through friends. Not until that quiet afternoon on a park bench 50 years later, when time itself decided to give them back just one more chapter. They sat side by side on the old bench, the wind teasing loose strands of Eleanor's hair, brushing them across her cheek like time itself was reaching out to touch her. James stared ahead for a long moment, heart thudding in a rhythm he hadn't felt in decades. "Eleanor," he said softly, as if the name itself might vanish if spoken too loud. She turned to him slowly, eyes already glistening. "I thought I might be dreaming." James gave a small laugh, half joy, half ache. "If this is a dream, it's a long time coming." There was silence between them, not the kind that begged to be filled, but the kind that wrapped itself around memory and gave it room to breathe. Then she said, "I looked for you, after the war, but you were just gone." He nodded. "I came back, hurt, quiet. You weren't there." "I'd moved," she said, voice trembling. "Got married. Not because I stopped loving you. I didn't know if you were alive." He didn't respond right away. He looked down at his hands, the lines and scars, the reminders of years that changed him. "I got your letters, or I got some of them. Too late. Most never made it to me." Eleanor placed her hand over his without asking. "I never stopped wondering." Neither of them asked why fate had waited 50 years. Instead, they began to fill in the missing pieces. James told her about the years in California, working with wood, building porches and tables, and trying to rebuild his own balance after the war. He never remarried, never found someone who made him forget her laugh. Eleanor spoke of her quiet life, her son, now grown and living in Chicago, her late husband, kind but distant. She had loved him in her way, but never like James. "I would lie in bed sometimes," she admitted, eyes on the trees, "and wonder if you ever made it home. If you were sitting on some porch somewhere, thinking about a yellow dress and a dance in the dark." He smiled, eyes misty. "Every damn year." They laughed quietly, like they had no right to it, but accepted the gift anyway. A family walked by, mother, father, little girl with a balloon. The child glanced curiously at the old couple on the bench. Eleanor smiled at her. James gave a little wave. Then came the silence again. But this time, it wasn't empty. "I used to picture this moment," Eleanor said, voice thin. "But I never thought it would come. I never thought I'd see your face again." "I didn't think I'd ever have the chance to say goodbye properly," James replied. Then he paused. "But now that you're here, I'm not sure I want to." She turned to him, eyes full. "Then don't," she whispered. They sat that way for a long while, their hands still touching, letting the years slip away like the leaves falling gently around them. No bitterness, no anger, just two people, weathered by time and war and silence, finally finding their way back to the place they never truly left. Each other. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the park path. Light filtered through the trees in amber beams, and the bench where they sat glowed with the kind of warmth that only late afternoon could give. Soft, forgiving, quiet. James looked at Eleanor as if trying to memorize her again. Not the girl from the photo in his wallet, but the woman she had become. The silver in her hair, the crow's feet around her eyes, the slight tremble in her hand. All of it was beautiful to him. Not despite the years, but because of them. "You know," he said after a pause, "I used to wonder what I'd say if I ever saw you again. I played the scene out in my head more times than I can count." "And now that you're here?" she asked gently. "I don't think words can carry 50 years, he said. "But maybe a moment like this doesn't need them." Eleanor smiled. She leaned back on the bench, exhaling slowly, her hand still resting on his. "Thomas used to say I looked out the window too much, that I was always waiting on something I couldn't name." James turned toward her. "And were you?" "I was waiting for you," she said simply, "even when I didn't know it." A breeze passed, carrying with it the scent of pine and something faintly floral. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. A dog barked. The world moved on. But here, on this bench, time softened. He looked at her with tears he didn't try to hide. "I never stopped loving you, Eleanor." "I never asked you to," she replied. "I think, deep down, I always hoped we'd meet again. Even just once. Even just to know." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the photo. Old, faded, worn at the edges. She stared at it, eyes wide. It was her, in that yellow dress, smiling just off camera. A moment frozen from a summer that never really ended. I kept this with me, he said. Through the mud, the blood, the years, everything. She reached out and touched the corner of the photo, as if to hold her younger self for just a second longer. I think we were lucky, she whispered. Lucky? He echoed. To have loved like that, she said. Some people spend their whole lives never feeling it once. We had it. And somehow, after everything, we get to sit here again. He nodded, his voice catching. We get to say goodbye the right way. But she shook her head softly. Number, not goodbye, James. Just thank you. They sat until the light began to fade. No rush, no urgency. The weight of time had already passed. And when they finally stood, slow, steady, hand in hand, the bench remained behind them, empty but full. A quiet witness to the reunion of two hearts that had waited half a lifetime for a single afternoon. They didn't look back as they walked together down the path. Because some chapters don't need endings, only peace. If this story touched your heart, we'd be honored to have you with us. Each day we share quiet moments that remind us what still matters. You can subscribe below to join us.